Hello everyone. Welcome to the Animal Futures Roundtable brought to you by Arihanta Institute. I am your host, Jonathan Dickstein, professor and lead organizer of the Vegan Studies Initiative at Arihanta. So first off, for those of you who are new to Arihanta Institute, I want to give you just a little bit of information about what we do here. So we are an academic institution dedicated to advancing education, scholarship, critical research, and public dissemination of the real-world application of the Jain values of nonviolence and compassion, and specifically in our everyday lives towards humans, non-humans, and the environment that supports us all. And the overall mission is to empower individuals to apply these principles of nonviolence, of compassion, as a force for positive change, addressing the most pressing issues that face us today. Now, there might be some of you here who don't know too much about the Jain tradition. And that is a really deep dive we could do, and we do so many other courses and offerings specifically about the Jain tradition. But what's extremely relevant is that Jains are the oldest vegetarian community in the world, practicing and teaching animal-focused vegetarianism for over 2 millennia. More recently, veganism has shown up on Jainism's ethical radar, both inside and outside of India. The Pundrapole, or Jain Animal Sanctuary, is another centuries-old manifestation of this long-standing Jain concern for the welfare of animals. So as a result of this, as a result of the overall mission of Arihanta Institute to teach nonviolence, to teach compassion, and also how in current times, kind of veganism, animal rights, more of these other concerns that we see in the mainstream in North America, in Europe, but also back in India, kind of showing up, especially also in the Jain community and in younger generations of the Jain community. As a result, in the spring of this year, Arihanta Institute launched the Vegan Studies Initiative to educate Jains and non-Jains alike about veganism and animal rights as tangible manifestations of this ethic of multi-species nonviolence. So apart from our many course offerings, Arihanta hosts special events, such as this one, to elevate experts in the field to share their experience, research, knowledge, and insights with the general public. All of the information about the Vegan Studies Initiative and about Arihanta Institute is available on our website, arihantainstitute.org. So let's pivot to today's event, Animal Futures, a roundtable on contemporary movement building. In recent years, the animal movement has paid increasing attention to theories of social change and how they can be integrated into the pursuit for animal justice. Most leaders agree that a diversity of approaches is necessary for building a mass social movement committed to ending factory farming, vivisection, zoos and aquariums, and other institutions of normalized animal exploitation. This roundtable brings together thought leaders in the animal movement to share their perspectives on shifting social norms and affecting tangible changes for animals in the years ahead. So I'd like to introduce our panelists or our guests, our conversation partners, and dive right in. So first, Monica Chen is the executive director of New Roots Institute, where she has overseen the development of a unique series of educational programs. New Roots educates high school and college students on the devastating impacts of factory farming and supports them as they become advocates for a just and sustainable food system. Monica earned her BA at UC Berkeley and her master's in education with a focus on the environment at the University of New Mexico. Thank you, Monica, for joining us. Courtney Dillard's background is in audience and context analysis, persuasive strategies, and social movement studies. She holds a bachelor's in communication studies from Vanderbilt, a master's from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and a doctorate from UT Austin. Courtney has been active in the animal movement for the past 30 years. Prior to joining Mercy for Animals, she combined an academic career with pro bono activities aimed at improving the communication strategies of various groups in the movement. At MFA, she supports teams seeking to increase effective paths towards social change for farmed animals. Thank you, Courtney, for joining us. Eva Hamer leads programs and policy for Pro Animal Future and Pax Fauna, organizations dedicated to building a political movement to end animal farming through grassroots campaigns that transform public support for animals into law through citizen-initiated ballot measures and voter bloc organizing. Eva has been organizing in the grassroots animal freedom movement since 2015, when she began working with Direct Action Everywhere in Chicago. She now lives in Portland, Oregon. Eva, thank you for joining us as well.
Much for having me.
I do want to mention that unfortunately, Leila Kassam, co-founder of Animal Think Tank, can't join us today due to some unforeseen circumstances, but we will forge ahead nevertheless. So the way this will work is that I'm going to ask the same question to our three guests, and they will have the opportunity to guide the course of the discussion from there. And then when we seem to have worked through some particular topic, I'll lob another question. But this is really in their hands, and a discussion more than any kind of presentation, as it were. We will have time for Q&A at the end, so please drop your questions in the Q&A box throughout the event, and I will get to as many of the questions as possible. Also throughout the event, Taina, also from Arihanta Institute, will be here dropping links and other information to kind of supplement what the topics we work through, the things we mention, maybe some sources, people, and so on. Okay. So when thinking about this event, and this is just a little mini preface to the first question, I was kind of reflecting on my own exposure to the animal movement, vegan movement in the past 20 or so years. And it seemed like a number of years ago, and maybe to some today, there was the thought that you either have like two choices, hand out flyers or be involved in some very, very like risky ventures, investigations, get videos. And these were kind of the only things. You're either educating about veganism on the street by handing out leaflets or doing something else. But it seems that over the years, at least part as a participant and as an observer, there's just so many different ways in which the animal movement has grown. And maybe that caricature actually never really applied to begin with. So my first kind of question is, if you all could describe from your own vantage points, histories, experiences, the current state of the animal movement to you and for you compared to where it was when you began. So it'd be great if you could share a little bit of how you got involved, what it seemed like, and maybe some big points about how it has changed, how it has remained the same. Well, let's start with Monica. I introduced Monica first. So how about Monica? Would you like to start us off?
I actually think that Courtney should start us off, because I think that with her more decades of experience, she'll be able to give a broader overview first.
Right. I love it. It's exactly what I want, not being in charge of the conversation. So Courtney, go first, please. Unless you're passing it to Eva, and then in which case I'll just fade.
New perspective. That's also another way in which we could take this. But no, I'll start. I will say that I came to the movement in 1990. I formed an animal rights group at Vanderbilt while I was an undergraduate there. I came, and I'm much more aware of this now than I was at the time, as a fourth generation animal advocate, which is somewhat unusual. My great-grandmother was active on working horse issues in New York City and in London. And then my grandmother was active on dog and cat, less dog issues, and my mother very anti-hunting, anti-fur. And then kind of coming down to both my brother and I working in the animal movement, my brother having worked in the movement for several decades. So I came to the movement, like many people did, the combination of reading Peter Singer and Tom Reagan, who unfortunately gets often the second billing. He's a wonderful philosopher for the movement, but then also being aware of PETA. So PETA came online in 1980 and really, I think, had an effect on a lot of young activists and helped supply them for things like you mentioned, tabling and education. So from that vantage point, and there are lots of ways I could look at what's happened in the movement since 1990. But I think a few of the things I wanted to point out is that when the movement started, there was like a flurry of activity in the US. And this I will just say right off the bat that my perspective is primarily US focused, because that's where I've lived and been a part of the movement. But I will say there was a flurry of activity and a lot of small groups emerged alongside larger groups like PETA. And then there was also transformation within larger existing groups like the Humane Society of the United States. So groups like that, that had never been active on some of these issues, had what we call radical flank effects, where the radical voices from PETA and other groups started to shift their tone and shift their topics. And so we did see a lot of changes coming, and really animal rights. I mean, really the birth of the animal rights movement, I would say, was in the 1980s, whereas there was animal welfare and animal protection prior to that in the US. So we're looking at a movement that's about 45 years old. And so in that time, one of the things that I think is really very striking is that the movement itself kind of radicalized. I was already talking a little bit about that, but when I joined, almost none of the advocates I know or I knew at that time were vegan. Almost everyone was vegetarian. And there were very few groups. PETA was pretty much the only larger group that was advocating for veganism. One of the famous stories in the movement that is hard to fact check these days, but I've heard several times, is that when Wayne Pacelle became president, he was vegan. When he became president of the Humane Society of the United States in 2004, the previous CEO president took him in DC to the prime rib to mark the point that he did not agree with these shifts towards the all animals perspective, and that was not the history of some of these more moderate, longer standing organizations. So we see within that course of time, lots of changes around the diet aspect. And part of that is just more options becoming available, more restaurants, more grocery items. It just became more tenable for people to really hold forth on all of their values. There are lots of things I could say additionally. I would say that the movement was very much more in the streets in the 90s, and that's a real change that I think would be interesting to discuss today, the value of a shifting identity for the movement. We were not strategic, but we were present and visible, and the media was very interested in what we were up to at that time. And we actually moved the needle on a lot of things in the 90s, cosmetic testing, animals and entertainment, and fur. All of those things started percolating in the 90s. And some of the wins that we've seen now, like cage-free, were also seeded at that time. So I would say that there's certainly been a shift in some of the ways in which we are doing the movement, but there has also been kind of a trajectory of change, and things that we're seeing come to fruition now were seeded earlier. The last thing I'd want to say is that, and I hope that my co-panelists will agree with me on this, is that there's much less infighting than there used to be. And that is hugely important because originally there was just a lot more ego, from my perspective, a lot more ego happening and a lot less willingness to collaborate. And as a result, a lot of things like the March for Animals that could have really had a longer, more effective trajectory than it did fell apart. So I am hopeful that as we go forward, there'll be more of that. I have lots of things I want to say about what I think has changed in the broader society, but I'll leave it at that for now, because we have made a lot of progress that you can only really know if you're older, like me, and you can really see it. And so I want to make sure we do kind of point out how different US society is regarding some animals in some ways at this time. So I'll leave it at that.
That's amazing, Courtney. I'm actually curious, do you agree that there's less infighting, Eva?
I definitely do. And when I started, for sure.
Nice. Courtney, I also appreciated the note about how the movement was a lot more in the streets. And I think that I am observing something similar, although there's a lot of reasons for that, one of which is the pandemic. The fact that we are all virtually here together is pretty incredible and definitely not something that I would have imagined 20 years ago. As I think about our space, I did want to acknowledge that there are a lot more interventions and strategies that we're being really thoughtful about at this point. And when New Roots Institute goes into classrooms, there's no such thing as a vegan class or an animal rights class at the high school level. We're going into health classes, environmental science classes, business classes, et cetera. So we're having to use the framework. We have to meet those standards to talk about all these issues related to animals. I think that because we're recruiting students from so many different majors, they are likely to want to think about how they can be active in this space through in their workplaces, in their careers. So that means that it's not just protesting. And I think, and by the way, especially with Eva on the call, I have a lot of respect for people who do protest. I just know that not everybody is Eva or is willing to protest like physically. So I'm grateful that there's more opportunities for that right now. One thing I do want to be mindful of, though, as we observe this shift in some of the strategies that are most visible, is I want to be really thoughtful about what we're measuring, because Jonathan, you were talking about leafleting earlier. I do think that there's a lot less leafleting than there used to be. And I think that one of the challenges we had was it was very difficult to measure, like, how many people went vegan, how many cows were immediately saved because of a leaflet. And I think that as we're thinking more about how this is a whole movement and how we're looking at different timelines of, this is not we cannot achieve animal liberation in 4 years or maybe 40 years or 400. People have different timelines. So as I think about like the role that leafleting played, I don't think just about like that single animal that could have been saved. I think about like how it contributed to bringing more people in. It was one of the easiest activities that we had to engage college students like really immediately with a form of activism that wasn't, as scary as going to a factory farm. When I think about, some of the initiatives around sharing food, as an example, like promoting Veg Fest, vegan food, et cetera. Again, very difficult to say like 3 chickens were saved as a result of this, but it was accessible. It did bring people in. It built trust. One of the things that we could probably get into more in detail is just like the public reception that people have towards veganism. Sometimes we have, tens of thousands of data points from all the classrooms lessons that we give, measuring, the diet change, measuring their willingness to support legislation like Prop 12 that passed in California. But I think that, one of my greatest successes in the classroom is like, I don't think people will be mean to vegans anymore. And that's actually like a really large cultural shift that I think I'm pretty excited about. And it does seem that we are riding this external wave of moral progress. Again, in our classrooms, I can't tell you exactly how many animals were saved, but I can share that all of our students have heard of the word vegan and vegetarian before. They've been to restaurants with vegans on the menu. They follow people on Instagram, and I'm really interested in looking at like how we can be measuring that project, how we can be measuring that progress, how we can be measuring that like larger societal shift, which I talk about with Courtney and Eva all the time.
Eva, would you like to kind of share a little bit as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So I got involved in the movement in 2015, and I had already been vegan for, I think, 10 years at that point. And so I love the news that people are nice to vegans now, because, being a vegan in middle school was not fun. But yeah, I got involved in 2015 in Chicago. I was a volunteer for DXE, Direct Action Everywhere. And I guess first I'll sort of take this from the kind of on the ground volunteer perspective, because I think that's, people who are putting in time in addition to their lives, jobs, families are still a really, really important part of this movement. So when I first started going to protests, I was invited to get involved in disruptions, which, if you don't know, those were DXE activists would go into restaurants, grocery stores, places where animals' bodies were being sold as food, and give a little speech. Excuse me, can I have your attention, please? What's happening today is, and we would give a little speech, and we'd stand there with our signs, and then we'd chant a little bit, and then we'd go out, and they would be about 5-minute experiences usually, and terrifying. It's such a experience of breaking social norms that when I think about kind of the impact, another thing where measurability is really difficult to talk about. Love that Monica brought up kind of that problem with leafleting, that just because the evidence isn't there for something doesn't mean it isn't effective. And I think that for a lot of the interventions that we have, it's just so difficult to measure effect on culture, and that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. It's really important work on that front happening. But one impact I can definitely say disruptions had was transforming activists. Was that we went from people who had not done this thing to people who had, gone into a restaurant. I've actually done it by myself, sort of. This is sort of a bit of a rite of passage to do like a solo disruption. To go by yourself into a crowded room and take the stage when there is no, stage to take, and talk about animals. And honestly, I feel my heart rate going up just talking about it. But I think this kind of thing really solidified a lot of people's identities as members of the movement. And I think that energy, that disruptive energy, that kind of righteous indignation, I'm going to stand up for what's right, also sort of got turned on each other in a way where my initial experience in the movement was of really, really a lot of infighting between activists in the same group, and infighting kind of between groups, or even the sense that every other group is not good. So when I was first kind of in DXE, I think DXE was a very different group than it is now. It's right now much more collaborative, much more kind of humble, much more interested in what other orgs are doing. And I just got a sense that of maybe disgust with welfareists, or disgust with the incremental side, or a sense that oh no, we're the ones who are really telling the truth. And I, fast forward to a few years later, I feel like that sentiment is just nowhere that I look. That there's just a humility, a collaborative spirit, a sense that, as somebody running an org myself, I'm really leaning on and looking up to other groups who are doing different things in a really big way. And I think that's a shift that I've found really, really helpful. One kind of example of this happened recently is an org that I know that maybe holds a little bit more of that, maybe has a little bit of at least a little bit of insularity, was actually cut off from funding with this, with that feedback. With oh, I really only want to fund a group that's learning from what other people are doing, that's plugged in, and not kind of reinventing the wheel over in their own little silo. Yeah, so I guess that's the kind of the biggest change that I've seen, is this sense that the movement is one body, a lot more than it was when I first got involved.
Well, I think there's also been a culture shift within the movement itself, right? Because if you talk about the different stages of veganism, quoting Colleen Patrick Goudreau, the first one is basically around this righteous indignation and the evangelism that, relates to the annoying stereotype that vegans can have. I'm noticing a question in the Q&A about, are people nice to vegans? I definitely have seen reports that people have disliked vegans as much as insert terrible thing here. At the same time, are there more restaurants with vegetarian options? Yes. Are more vegans being accommodated? Yes. Is it more normal to be vegetarian or vegan on a college campus? Absolutely, yes.
Yeah,
and just going back to some of Eva's points, I think that when you evolve and you really start, and if you go through a new roots training, or you spend time at the ABA summit, there's a lot more humble self-awareness, there's a lot more of a willingness to like not totally think that you're right 100% of the time. Like you're open to hearing. There's like actual receptivity. And I think bringing that into our culture, into our conversations, you know, like when I'm in calls with Eva and Courtney, I'm ready to be proven wrong like all the time. And if I didn't come in that way, I think that would lead to a lot more infighting. So as more people have just learned about behavior change, how you actually persuade people, it isn't by telling them that they're wrong and telling them what to do. There has to be that openness that I think has like shifted some of that culture and those stereotypes. Go ahead, Courtney.
Yeah, that was a great segue into the point. I was just going to say that Chris Bryant and some others have done research, and they haven't done longitudinal studies, but just what are your attitudes towards vegans in the UK, and have seen, you know, more positive results than they expected. That as seeing them as ethical, as seeing them as healthy, as you know, having several positive attributes. And I think at MFA we have this idea of your attitudes towards, or do you know vegans, and those kinds of things are important. And what Monica was just referring to is this recognition of the role of research and how research can help us understand how we can actually make the change that we are hoping to make. And I would say that one of the biggest changes in the movement that I've witnessed is the emergence of research organizations like Faunalytics, which was the Humane Research Council originally, that emerged for a long time before it began to get real credit. Right. So it was around and people were kind of like, hey, that doesn't seem authentic or genuine to use these studies. And but now it's in a much different place. And I think people recognize that if we really do want the things that we say, we have to be more humble, to have more humility, and to put our noses down and you know, and look at the books and see what you know, what social change takes and how people, particularly for our issue, need to be approached. So I feel like that's a real advance that I'm proud to have seen and to have been a part of to a small degree.
I'll add one more thing. Just yeah, this thought about kind of how are vegans perceived and how is animal rights kind of perceived as legitimate. I'm also sort of sensing this difference in how the animal rights movement is kind of seen. Not all the time, but in general, I've noticed kind of other movements treating us with a lot more respect than I did at the beginning. Still a bit of a black sheep, right? And when I'm talking to other animal rights, or sorry, other social justice groups, there's this, yeah, this sense that like, okay, yeah, we're doing something similar, we're working on different things, and there's this mutual respect. Example of that, just kind of anecdotally, is I'm doing this voter block organizing, talking to all these city council candidates, kind of trying to get people on board with animal rights, with you know, endorsing them kind of in return for a promise to do a lot of pro-animal legislation. There was just sort of very, very quickly this sense of legitimacy about that we are absolutely being taken seriously as a group, as a movement, and it's in a way that I really couldn't imagine happening, you know, 10 years ago.
I love to hear Eva say that, because she and I are both active in Oregon. That's where I'm mostly based, and she's in Portland. And I was on a call with Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the new director there yesterday was saying that they are working to remove all consumptive-oriented language from the Fish and Wildlife Service literature. So game will no longer be used, and other things like that. And of course, as a person with background in communication studies and language, these things are really important. They're very quiet, but they frame how people see animals. The pronouns one is another big one. It is a thing. So when I was astounded by this information. It was pro-offered. And Eva, I'd love to hear that you were kind of also feeling like there was receptivity to our issues in the work you're doing there.
I love that. That's amazing. Thanks for sharing.
It's a great conversation. It makes me think of, you know, even when I actually met Eva in Colorado in early 2010s or so, and similar to Courtney, what you're saying is kind of a lot of the interest I had coming from like a background in philosophy, and I was doing more work in philosophy and just paying attention to the language that was being used in a lot in the movement, and being like, there's something just doesn't feel right sometimes. And I think it's wonderful that you see in literature coming out these small changes that bespeak of ways to influence these larger social norms that just kind of certainly get affected by literature, advertisements, dialogue in general. Just to color this question, I want to go back to something that was came up right away, that something Courtney mentioned, but I think might not be, how would I say, readily understandable to a mass audience, is this notion that the movement has pivoted a bit from the streets. It used to be in the streets. So, and we've talked a little bit about research, but maybe each of you want to talk about, well, if we've pivoted from the streets, where now has it gone? If we assume that obviously there are still people in the streets doing the work that they've always done on college campuses and elsewhere, but what are some of these other venues that seem to have emerged from more strategic approaches to animal advocacy? Anyone?
Well, I'll start by saying I think that people are still out on the streets. There are still a lot of things happening. It's just whether or not it's visible. And I always tell our students that, like, you can do a protest, you can do a veg fest on your campus, but if you're not amplifying that via social media, if you're not basically training the trainers, if you're not teaching other people to replicate what you're doing, I don't think that is reaching its full impact potential. So that's where, like, a little bit of that strategy comes in, where, like, you're really intentional about what you're doing, because it's not just about the people who visibly are driving their cars and seeing you go by. It's about, like, everybody else, that entire audience that exists online. So I just wanted to start off that there. And I know, Eva, you're really intentional about this.
Yeah, we're definitely in the streets. And I've, changed kind of in this journey from street activist to now I work behind a computer most of the time. I've definitely moved from the streets myself. And so it's difficult for me totally to identify, is that my experience? Now I'm going to, conferences where other people who have movement jobs are there, and I'm talking to them and they also work behind computers, or is the experience of a volunteer activist mostly the same? I know that the change that I've experienced in, the direction that I've been working on have gone from, we did a lot of protests at the beginning. When I worked with DXE, it was a lot of protests. And now we're working on ballot initiatives, on getting people to circulate petitions, get signatures from voters, get laws on the ballot, and then go try to get yes votes, which is a very different experience than going to a protest, and has different barriers, which is really, really interesting to me. On one hand, the protests that I described earlier are, like, so difficult to get yourself to do. It's such a big change, big getting outside your comfort level to go yell in a restaurant or interrupt a sports game or something. And there's something sort of isolated about that you're kind of almost a performance, almost a stage performance. I know somebody who had really, really terrible social anxiety, couldn't really have a conversation with anybody, but was still able to perform on a stage because there's something sort of, you're in your little bubble. And so maybe a protest is sort of like a stage where the shift that I'm seeing / facilitating is towards these conversations, towards, like, going to voters and having a conversation where we really try to frame animal issues as political and as civic. And it's something that's really really difficult for a lot of people. Knocking on doors, stopping people in public, this kind of thing. So yeah, that's very anecdotal, very just kind of from where I'm standing. I've also become aware of animal activism mentorship in the last couple of years, and they have a mentorship program, and they also do these get-togethers called convergences, or call them different things. But they'll just kind of descend on one city and do a ton of, usually fur protests, or to really energize kind of whatever campaigns going on in that area. And from anywhere that you see AAM, super rowdy, super in the streets, definitely movement hasn't moved away from the streets.
Yeah, I'll just say that there's no doubt that there are some people who are doing kind of what we would consider protest demonstrations and public, kind of activities or what have you. In the 90s, the number of people who were involved was much greater, right? So you would have a protest of 200 people rather than 25. And the media coverage was much more an element. The media was interested because we were new, right? A lot of it was novelty. I think you can get large protests, perhaps, but I think it's more difficult, and that has to do with a lot of other things. So I don't really want to, I don't really feel able to necessarily speak to all of the reasons why, from my perspective, it looks different than it did. But I will say that there have been, we've I think become a lot smarter, but it's still taking a fair amount of time in terms of targeting audiences, like this idea of like, let's talk to everybody, which often a protest is structured in that way, right? Like, as whoever's coming by, whoever might, be in the restaurant, or I think we've gotten a lot better at figuring out who might be receptive to our messages. I mean, Monica's work, I think young people are a huge, that would be my number one place to be thinking about a demographic and a psychographic is progressive young people. We have so much more of a chance, I think, with that group. They haven't built the identity of animal consumption over a lifetime. And so that kind of audience targeting. And then I like what Eva said, having the conversation. I mean, obviously there are more and more people all the time, but I have found that MFA is becoming increasingly interested in social clusters and in ways to kind of have the conversation because it takes that. This is, what we're asking people to do would be under a kind of Doug McAdams, like high risk activism stuff, which is change your diet, change what you do every day, 3 times a day. That is not going to be something that is going to be changed because someone sees a billboard. The vast majority of people, there are outliers, but we need to have the conversation, and we need to have it again and again. And so one of the things that I think that has changed that we need to be aware of, and I think we need to be very strategically aware of, is that at least in the US, most people are aware that factory farming exists. Whether they downplay what numbers of animals are in factory farms or how bad it is, or whether the animal products that they consume are from those factory farms, regardless of those details, they know what it is. For the majority of people asked in the survey, they've heard of these conditions. It's salience that is the problem, right? So salience is the idea that something is top of mind when you're going to go do the behavior. So while if somebody asks you like, hey, do you think farmed animals should, be able to turn around? Of course, the vast majority of people, like 85% of people will say yes. But then the vast majority of people don't think about that animal when they go to buy a sausage. So I think something that the movement, we've done a good job actually in getting people more educated about some of these key topics and key concerns that we have. But we have to move on to the next phase and get very strategic with limited resources about how we can keep this top of mind for people when they are in the consumptive moment, right? When they're at the grocery store or the restaurant. And so I would say that the movement is getting better at thinking about who we should be talking to, how we should be talking about them, but we also need to be thinking about where are they mentally? They're not in the same place as the people I was talking to in the 90s are. And that's because of our good work.
I wanted to answer your question even more directly, Jonathan, because Courtney is talking about consumption. Sometimes people think about this issue in terms of supply and demand. So if we change what's in the supply, if the animals are not in the supply and you have like the lentils or whatever meat alternatives there are available, like people are more likely to get. So there are people working on the supply side, and there's a lot of different strategies there. On the other menu of interventions related to consumption, Farm Forward and Animal Charity Evaluators each list like 16 different interventions. Some of them overlap. And I want to bring this like more directly to an example I think a lot of folks on this call are familiar with, which is JANA, or Young Janes of America conferences. And I actually don't see anybody protesting at these conferences, but I do see us employing a lot of other strategies there, right? You have speakers, you had me there. I was showing videos that some of our fellow investigators took. I was talking about legal and policy work. We were sampling out food. We were strategizing with the organizers. We were trying to make it so that vegan food, and by the way, major progress there, right? YJA was vegan this year. It was vegan the year before that. I'm hopeful that Jana will be vegan this year. So there's a lot that had to be done. And shout out to the Vegan Jane Initiative, Himzak Eco Vegan Committee. Like, there's so many strategies that they're employing in terms of talking to who's financially supporting those conferences and helping to drum up that grassroots support as well, so that people are circulating these ideas amongst the community. And I do believe that each of us is uniquely positioned to create change within our communities. It's just about finding the right interventions and making sure that's a match for your skill set. Sometimes I worry that people think too much about how they can have the most impact, and it doesn't align with their skill set. People come to me all the time and say, I want to be giving lessons in schools. I'm like, well, are you a teacher? Right? Like, I'm a teacher, so it makes sense for me to be doing that. But if you don't have behavior management down, if public speaking is not your thing, that's okay. You don't have to be out there in the schools. You can be doing XYZ. And again, there's just so many different strategies that we're employing within our communities. And I think YJA is a phenomenal example of that.
Just to kind of thank you so much. I love these insights, and I think it'll help me kind of pivot to something else I'm curious about. But I also appreciate what you said about skill sets and passion. And I think that also bleeds into longevity, right? You know, someone who's doing something they're good at or enjoy doing will continue to do it. But if you tell someone, say, you know, go into this place and do this action that's extremely isolating and gives you a lot of fear, and it's not part of your normal like of repertoire, maybe you'll do it, maybe you're not, but you might not continue doing it. So I really appreciate the way in which there's grown sensitivity to individual skills, their temperaments, their comfortability, because there really are so many ways to get involved. But I think within your kind of the group, the organizations you work with, and a lot of your colleagues, these theories of social change over the past few decades have significantly affected the animal movement. And so I want to see if I can tie these two questions or topics together. I guess first, I'm just curious about like right now, what are you excited about at this time, knowing how things have changed? And if it's possible, while thinking about that, to maybe have your answer informed by kind of the theories of social change that you and your organizations are working with, because I think they're less familiar to the general public. Courtney mentioned social clustering, right? We could also talk about certain forms of organizing. I guess they'd be less known to the general public, who might just be thinking like, what we need to do is make vegetarians, make vegans, make individuals one by one. So I guess I'm really terrible at asking a question in one short manner, but really basically what I'm saying is like, how have the theories of social change you're working with make you passionate about the certain projects you're working on right now? Is that sufficient? I hope that's the shortest I can get.
I can start. I will say that I'm super excited about our organization's recognition of the value of trigger events. So trigger events really are the events that happen, primarily they're externally based. That is, that the organization doesn't have control over what happens, although there are some small kind of localized situations where you could create a trigger event. But in general, trigger events happen, something like COVID, right? And that event galvanizes public interest, it gets media attention, and if it coincides with the issue that you're trying to be a proponent of, or raise awareness around, or make moves on, then you have a better opportunity to get your message out there, because it's relevant, more relevant than it typically would be. So for organizations and movements that have very little resources, we have to kind of keep our eyes out for these external events that we can then rapidly respond to and take advantage of to move our message further, faster, right? And so that requires kind of having a sense of what kinds of things, like pandemics or in a more localized fashion, animal rescue-ish kind of events that the media captures the media attention, or climate change scenarios that we can, strongly link to our issues, that we have these opportunities. And MFA has seen some real gains from being aware for example, in Brazil, we've been interested in banning live export there. Earlier this year, there was a ship that was, I think, bound for Iran that had a lot of media attention because they got rerouted and there was a lot of smell and a lot of upset in the port where it was. And so that allowed the opportunity for our for people on the Brazilian team in the political sphere to meet with people that they had never had the opportunity to access, because those political leaders saw that it was in the public sphere and in the media attention. So recognizing where these issues might emerge, having rapid response plans, and getting as much as we can out of those events is something that I think we really need to be thinking more about, and that we are thinking more about now.
So, yeah, go ahead.
Go, Eva.
So yeah, I love the thinking of trigger events, and I think that's super important. When I'm pondering this question myself, I'm thinking about per animal future didn't exist much more than, I mean, we started last year, and we started with this front loading time as Pax Fauna, where we did all this research to kind of try to figure out how to build a kind of mass movement organization with this real intent to mobilize ordinary people to take action for animals. And the piece that we really landed on is that there's a cultural problem, that, we're talking about supply and demand. A lot could change with supply, and still there would be a really strong cultural attachment to meat. I think this has kind of been mentioned, sort of danced around a few times in this conversation, that we're, I think all three of us, really thinking a lot about cultural interventions. Like, okay, if ordinary people would still buy meat, would still feel really attached to meat, even if it cost way more than the alternative, even if it were less convenient, then, like, okay, now what is it that we could touch with culture? And that leads me to the idea that the people around us dictate what's normal. This mention of like social clusters is super important. That if there's just one group of people, if the people that you're the closest to are like hold a particular belief, that belief is going to become so much more normal to you, even if kind of the rest of the world stays the way that it is. And so when we're talking about targeting groups of people and not just individuals, I mean, the ask of going vegan of a person who is going to be the only one doing it, who's going to be the only vegan they know, is like astronomically difficult. And I can say that because I did it, and I fully understand that that's not something that is going to be a reasonable ask to most people. Yet when I know a lot of people who maybe lived with a vegan or lived with a couple vegans or had some vegan friends, and that person kind of making a shift towards veganism, more towards activism, is a lot more normal. There's just something kind of in your whole nervous system that just gravitates towards something that feels normal, that feels like you're going to get more acceptance from doing it than from not doing it. And so a lot of different ways to affect culture, like really a lot of different interventions that we can think of that could affect that sense of normal. Like, are the people around me okay with this idea in the most basic sense? And the one that I'm excited about right now is kind of in the political sphere, in making some issue of animals kind of the local issue, the thing that we're all debating, that we're all talking about. Even if we decide against it, it's like there's this right now in Denver, there's a political issue that is about slaughter, and the hope there is that conversation kind of makes some effect on culture.
I appreciate the emphasis on social clusters, because that's what we're trying to do in our campuses, right? In our schools, where we are building up this, almost positive energy around eating more plant-based foods, and stigmatizing eating a lot of animal-based products. And what's really key is that you're learning this information from somebody that you respect because your teacher brought you in, and you are hearing this and you're doing this in community with the other people who influence you. I think that when we talk about influencers, sometimes we give a little bit too much attention to the folks like the Kim Kardashians with hundreds of millions of followers, but realistically, who is going to be most influential to an individual? It's the people closest to them. It's your peers, right? It's the folks that you're interacting with every single day. So I do encourage the folks on this call to be really thoughtful about who they can be influencing, just even by living their lives and like, you know, showing support for something or showing distaste for another thing. And I also just felt like we should probably answer like a few of the questions in the chat, like really quickly. I think, Sanjay, we have answered your question because it really is about supply and demand and creating that culture shift, creating that demand for some of these other products. When we're talking about like what people should be doing, I don't think any of us would say that there's one single effective strategy, like one single effective intervention. Like it does take a lot of them. That does not mean that I think all nonprofits and all strategies are like equally funded. Like some of them are like, you know, this is the time for them. But I did want to note that like, as I think about scaling, as I think about like the success of our movement, I think about how we're able to leverage people in different industries, which is why I would not say, Aniket, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, that you should go and work for Mission Barnes, which is a great company, but I'm not going to tell you to go and do that because there's also great possibility that in your current place of work, you are somebody that we really need as an ally. When I think about some of the default work that's been done at LinkedIn or New York City public hospitals, that happened because there was an ally in that place of work and they were able to really champion a lot of things, like working with the folks who had like traditionally like more paid jobs in the movement or working for nonprofits. So really be thoughtful about how we can be influencing others and how we can be positioning people so that they can be key allies in the support of our campaigns.
I think that seems to be that is an excellent point. I remember years ago when I was already in academia, but being exposed more and more to these issues of kind of leaving. But it was also, I used to think like, if you're in a line of work, if you leave, the odds are that the next person who's coming in is going to be speaking the way you do and affecting that community, because if not, then you lose that ally in a place where we might not get any kind of replacement. Whereas if you go work elsewhere, there are other people who might easily replace. So, I mean, alas, 10 years later, I'm still in academia trying to kind of work on those aspects or those making inroads there. So, and I want to maybe just make one more thing about Eva's point, and then I think, Monica, you're right, we can go kind of and use the Q&A questions to kind of still talk about these issues. Is I remember back, what is it, 2002, when New York City banned smoking indoors in bars or restaurants. And I remember around that time how many people I knew smoked and fully supported the ban that was coming, but they did not quit smoking in advance of the ban taking effect. So they are fully in support of a societal, a social change, but that doesn't mean it's going to affect their individual change to do that in advance of some kind of social stigma, social agreement, social enforcement. And I think about that often, obviously, right, in this kind of huge ask, like Eva said, this monumental ask, isolate yourself without any, so you actually will be stigmatized because you're making the change, not because you're not making the change, and maybe be alienated from your community. Now have to find your community. Whereas I have asked people who think, you know, we've had the stats on it too, right? People who support the banning of slaughterhouses, but still it's not going to affect their individual change. So I think that's massively important, and why what you three are speaking about with these notions of changing norms, changing your social groups is kind of become the norm. It just seems the norm now from the movement level, what's happening. So just on that note, because I think we're still involved with messaging, and there is another talk here from another question, excuse me, from Deb, that's talking a bit about messaging. And maybe if you want to talk about like how even in messaging have we changed our opinion about like welfare and rights, abolition versus kind of quote unquote single issues and so on. Maybe based in some research, what seems to be the dominant or the preferred strategy, either collectively among you three or say individually in the groups you associate with?
I take a first crack at this one. So I mentioned early in my activism, there was kind of a sense that all the other groups were doing it wrong. And there was the real sense of like welfarism and abolitionism just completely being at odds. And part of that was like the sense of integrity, which I'm also kind of reading in the question of animals are not objects. Animals are not for human consumption. It is not okay to use them in any way. And I truly believe that. And there's also a question of, okay, well, when I talk to people with that tone, that usually doesn't work. So what can I do that like literally that keeps me in a sense of integrity? I don't want to feel icky. I don't want to say things that I don't believe. I don't think that will work. I think that kind of being disingenuous is like pretty obvious. And I want to make interventions on the world that are effective. And so I think that with that just comes a sense of not being tied to any one message and being open to evidence that comes out. I was really surprised not that long ago to learn that there's not actually any evidence that welfare improvements increase complacency. So people who are exposed to, hey, we just passed Prop 12, hey, all the eggs are cage free now. People exposed to that message don't then report less motivation to work on animal issues. That was an assumption that was really deep to all of our like strongly held beliefs about abolitionism, was that like, well, if you're just making people feel better about doing something violent. And we actually don't have any evidence about that. And still, I want to work on things that tell a story of society moving away from using animals for food. I want to give a sense that the future is less animal use, not different animal use. And so when I think about ways to do that, it's actually really hard. So we settled on this slaughterhouse ban because in Denver, there's the largest lamb slaughterhouse in the country, and banning it feels like something that tells the story of the future moving away from using animals for food. And okay, not every city has a slaughterhouse. Talking about doing different kinds of factory farm bans, but really like what we're landing on is something that sounds a lot more like welfare. Like, okay, maybe we can ban factory farms by requiring pasture access. And then the kind of effect would be, you can't have a factory farm because factory farms don't have pastures. And yet the wording will kind of be very welfare. So that's where I'm at with all of this. And I'm really happy to know that there's more research going on into these questions, and they're really big questions and really important questions, because that's like, how do we do this? How do we phrase the message most effectively? I think that's kind of one of the most important messages, like has been said before, like people, like Jonathan was saying, like we really care about animals. And when you ask anybody, like in certain ways, they'll say really supportive things about animals, and then they themselves don't change their diet, and they themselves might even reject certain policy asks that you put in front of them. And so the question of like, okay, how do we harness that latent public support that's in people already? They want to protect animals in some way. I think it's an open question. How do we harness that in a way that's going to make the most change?
Courtney or Monica?
This is a tough one. It's obviously been at the heart of some of the things I mentioned early on about the infighting, and the rights versus welfarist has been with us all along. I would say that at this point, kind of back to what we were saying in regard to the emergence and greater weight given to research, that most people recognize that change does not happen overnight, especially large daily behavior change. And so with that in mind, it's back to what Eva was saying, is you kind of have to figure out what you're going to say to whom at what time, and like what's going to work. But one thing I've been trying recently that is different is to say who I want to be, right? And without being like a moral like wearing the moral mantle too much, but just this idea of like, I live in a world with other species. When I look at them, I often see joy. I often feel like a lot of magic in the lives that they're leading. I happen to be born in a time where I don't have to exploit them really pretty much in any way to do my life and to live well. I mean, this is outside of climate change, larger issues, but and so I want to be a person who celebrates those species. And so those are the choices that I'm making. And I think almost everyone can make those choices. And if you'd like to know more, or I'm happy to share how I'm doing that or what have you. But there's something that I have found some traction with this recently about is who I want to be. And it comes out of the joy that I see in the other species that are on this planet with me. And I want to be happy alongside them. And I don't want to cause them unhappiness. So it's not exactly an answer to your question, but it kind of avoids this. Either you do this or you do that. I'm like, well, here's one way you could look at it. So
I can also just briefly share our approach at New Roots Institute. So we have to tailor every single lesson to the specific class, right? Like a 9th grade health class is going to be very different from an MBA class. What's key, though, is that we always talk about what factory farming is or the way that animals are raised. And that includes like the confinement piece. And spoiler alert, 99% of all animals in the United States are coming from these factory farms. And we'll go into some of the labels, which are still factory farmed, right? Cage-free, whatever the labels are. Like there's so much that the students have heard of and they want to talk about. And we actually like give those examples and we're like, this is what it is. And they're like, oh my gosh, that is terrible. So, but it's them asking the questions, and that's really key. It's not me telling you. They are asking the questions. And it just creates the dialogue. And I think that that's what's really critical is the dialogue piece around this. And by the way, our students are, for the most part, like they go to Taco Bell. Taco Bell doesn't let you choose between like certain labels of their cheese. Like you get that cheese. And if you know what the cheese is coming from, then you have a choice to make, and you can influence the other people around you as well after this lesson. I say Taco Bell because at YJA, all the students really like Taco Bell. So they're all vegetarians and they're all going to Taco Bell. So I do give that example of like, after this lesson that we've just had at YJA, how can you be influencing the other people who want to go to Taco Bell?
I have my own long history with Taco Bell as well in teenage years. Maybe many of us do. So I'm looking at the questions, and right now I see kind of two kind of categories, and one's more specific and then one's more general. And I think in our in the time we have, we can answer these and maybe beyond them. But there's a couple questions. One here from Thomas, who's a filmmaker themselves. Thank you for being here, Tommy, who's asking about how do you think photography and films and imagery play at this time in the animal movement. And there's a question before that also kind of a bit about imagery and the kinds of images we share. I know these aren't exactly the same question, but they are speaking about not just text and reading and discussion, but also the use of film. And then there's another question, which I think is the key here, is that if we're talking about social norms and not making these kinds of asks that might make us feel better, but don't affect the kind of change we're looking for, I think people do want to know the ways that they can start to change in their behaviors and tactics towards affecting their social groups in ways that they simply might not know, that are more just like confrontational conversations, right? I find a lot of people who don't really know what else can I do? What are other tools I have? But okay, so we'll get to that. But first, I'd like to ask you all, and maybe Courtney, this has been a big part, obviously, of MFA, and Eva, I know you have history as well. What do you think, like, the role of films and other imagery has had, and what it has now, and where you see as its place moving forward? Courtney, you can go first this time.
I think that investigations and images are hugely important at impacting the people who are open to being impacted, right? I think almost all of us who are in the movement engaged with the movement after seeing some kind of imagery. And so for those people who don't turn away images of misery, really, and pain and sadness and suffering, those are things that are incredibly activating and motivating to do the work. But there is a much larger group of people, and we have done some research on the landing page of our website, for instance, that when confronted with these images, just immediately shut down, they avoid, right? So there are many different strategies that one has to be able to kind of keep the identity as an animal consumer. And that one of the largest ones is avoidance. And so I think we have to be thoughtful about the images and we have to use them. I love Eva was saying early in the call, that's not confidential, is it, Eva, what you're sharing about the, okay, was saying earlier in the call that they have investigative footage from the slaughterhouse that they're trying to ban in Denver. I think that's really important to that effort because you can point to it and say, this is happening, and this is happening to this kind of animal. This is happening down the street from you. But I think that we have seen the media's attention fall away a little bit from our investigative activities as a movement as a whole. And so that we have to be very thoughtful about what we are doing with images. And then the last thing I'll say is that I think research in general suggests that the pictures of one animal rather than a large group of animals is more effective. And that, you know, a combination of some research suggests that happy animals are better in some instances than unhappy animals. But I think obviously we wouldn't be anywhere without images, but we have to be very strategic in who we are using them and what time and in what way to kind of move the message forward. Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this, but I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I think investigations are really important. And yeah, Courtney said, like, the people who are willing to not turn away are going to be really affected by those. And a lot of people are turning away from those that have, you know, a lot of people have this sense that I don't want to see that and I don't want to think about that, which is frustrating, of course. And I'm really interested in fiction. When I think about a film, I'm thinking about, you know, fictional stories. I think that there's a lot of money that goes into think about product placement in TV and movies is not always as obvious as it sometimes is. Sometimes people will actually pay for an idea to be said by a character in a show because it's very understood that these are, you know, almost social relationships that we're having in the world with these characters that we kind of get to know in fiction, and they can kind of influence what we feel like is normal. Like if there's a character who's a cool person who's also vegan or also has some little storyline where they're interested in protecting an animal. I think I'm excited about the prospect of this kind of thing being really normalizing. I read a book recently, just like a novel that did this kind of thing very well, where absolutely was not something that I would read. I don't know why I read it. Maybe somebody did recommend it to me for this reason, but it's called Remarkably Bright Creatures. It's by Shelby Van Pelt, and really just a novel that I was reading for entertainment, had an animal who was a character, and that animal was suffering in confinement. And that confinement was understood as a tragedy for the human characters in the book. And it wasn't an activist book. It wasn't something that was that was kind of so in your face that you'd be like, oh, this isn't for me if you're not an animal person. And this kind of thing is really exciting for me, this prospect of telling stories in a way that people are interested in and in ways that are kind of entertaining or enriching in their own right and contain the stories that we want to have told. I think that's very kind of similar to this theme of we want advocates in every industry. And I think we especially want advocates in creating really engaging and popular fictional content.
I wanted to add that it's a school day. So New Roots Institute is probably showing footage of farms and showing photos right now, like as we speak, like in the classrooms. They're very powerful. We use them at YJA too. That said, I think that there are a lot of people who are trying to create documentaries right now. There's just seems to be a decent number of filmmakers who are raising funding to support documentaries. And documentaries tend to be relatively expensive compared to, I don't know, a leaflet. I'm not saying it doesn't have value. I'm just saying that like the initial thought some people have as they're looking at like the huge number of requests for funding is like, oh, a documentary costs more than, a smaller project. And things have the landscape for has changed. You know, it's very difficult to get onto Netflix right now. You can put something on YouTube and it's possible that not a lot of people will see it. I would argue that New Roots Institute has probably like done just like helped invisible vegans so much, because like in every single racial justice class, like I've shown invisible vegan to, you know, so many people, right? Same with Game Changers. Like we've helped to get those new audiences. But if you don't have a good mechanism for showing that content, I am a little bit worried that there's a lot of footage out there and people are putting a lot of time into it and funding, because I'm just so aware of like our resources as a movement. As you're thinking about, Thomas, like what's most effective, it's not, the question isn't just about like, is it powerful? It's really like, can it be seen? And if you need to, it does take like considerable strategy and marketing to get it into people's screens where they're actually going to watch it.
That reminds me of that phrase I heard years ago while I was teaching. Someone said, it's not what you know, it's what they learn. And what they learn isn't just if it's powerful or not. It's like, do they actually see it? Are they in a space to be receptive to it? And I find that to be a really great point, Monica. Thank you. So I guess I would like to pivot to this other, there are other questions, and some are very specific, and maybe we'll touch on them as well. But I would like to, you know, we have about 15 minutes or so to enter in a bit of discussion about empowering individuals. I started off by saying that a lot of what we do at Arihanta and what we're trying to do in what we call engaged chain studies is really talking about actualizing values. I'm a compassionate person. How do I perform it? I want to perform it. And it gets back to what Courtney was saying. It's the kind of person I want to become. I don't want to just believe in nonviolence philosophically. Like I want to embody it. I want to kind of like feel it in my instincts. And so I think maybe some of you have thoughts on how individuals can start to get involved in these ways to shift norms. Because I agree with you, Monica, it's kind of wild. Yeah, I didn't meet a vegetarian until I was a junior in college. I had never met a vegan at all. I had never heard the term. So I agree, there is so much more presence and prevalence. So what might be some ways that you would suggest, whether it's getting involved in organizations or just operating in their individual spheres? Could you help advise some of our audience in this respect? Monica, why don't you go first? Because I think it was Eva and Courtney last. And
I love this whole question around actualizing our values. And as I think about how much our movement has grown and how much we've evolved, and, you know, I do take some of the points around, you know, how there might be less infighting. I think it's because we have a lot of internal work to do as advocates, right? If you want to be an impactful advocate, there's a lot of internal work that you've got to do, because there is so much anger that can come up, or so much empathy, so much sadness as you really learn about the realities. And that's something I encountered at YJA. It's that, you know, people have this idea that in India, the cows were treated a very specific way. And that is certainly not the case, at least at Taco Bell was the point that I was making. And it really comes down to what kind of person do you want to be? And I think that this next generation is more likely to be anxious, more depressed. There's awareness of things like climate change. There's awareness of lots of bad things that happen in the world. And I think that what we have to do at New Roots Institute when we're going into these classrooms is really empower those students to start trying to make a difference, because the alternative is to be somebody who just gives up. And I think that's a far worse place to be. I think that it's really critical that people have some identity around how they are living their values and how they're being somebody that they want to be. And really, so I guess where I'd start, and I know that we can talk more about like specific actions and strategies, but I think a lot of this begins with self-reflection.
yeah, that's great. I think that's a great way to start. And then we can like kind of circle back and maybe, you know, like brainstorm. Because I always found that like, you know, one thing you can do, make one ask. You know, it's how like therapists often act with their patients. Like, before we meet next time, can you just do this one thing and come back and tell me about it next time? So we can start. I love that notion of kind of slowing down, self-reflection as the starting point. I don't know, Eva, do you have any thoughts too? And then I'll let you all kind of round it out.
answer to kind of what can we do as an individual to help is I forget who this is quoted from. Almira Tanner from DXC is the one who told it to me, is to stop being an individual. Is that we are fundamentally quite weak as individual people, and the way to make a difference in the world is to organize. And that can look a lot of different ways. But the sort of image I have in my mind right now is to organize in a way that makes it easy for the next person who's asking that question to find you and to join. And so that has to do with visibility, with approachability, with having spaces that are super easy to get involved in, that are super welcoming to new people, having activist communities that also have open social events. People can come and join in a very low pressure environment, having activist communities that are very open in every way, that it's very easy to find what the next thing is, and that people are generally friendly and have sort of done some of the work that Monica's talking about, that we are treating each other really, really kindly and really well.
My response is, because I'm a list maker, and I can be very practical in nature, my response is to be much more specific. I think there is a lot of joy that comes out of saying, I'm going to do something for animals every day, one thing. And I'm going to have some fun figuring out what that is going to be. But some things that people can do every day for animals would be, for instance, to say, okay, in this week, it's easier for me to kind of go, okay, in this week, on Monday and Wednesday, I'm going to go, as I walk down, I'm in New York right now, as I walk down the street, I'm going to go into 3 to 5 places and ask if they have vegan options. Places I don't think do have vegan options. And then they know that someone asked about whether there are vegan options there. I think askivism is something that you can do very easily, and can have some fun. And sometimes you're pleasantly surprised. I think you can post something on social media once or twice a week that you have really thought about who you're going to share it with. Maybe you're going to, another time, you're going to join a conversation around a blog post and lend your perspective. Wearing a t-shirt. I never see any animal rights t-shirts, and I don't have very many myself. But just wearing a t-shirt that says I'm vegan and I vote, or whatever it might be, is hugely powerful. So if you just wear your t-shirt once a day, you're changing the norms, because people are looking around and seeing somebody with that t-shirt on. And then finally, in the social realm, I think taking friends that are not vegan to vegan restaurants that are good, and just putting a little money in your budget aside to get lunch for a friend, and just say, I want you to be exposed to these vegan options that you might not be aware of. Or as my friend in San Luis Obispo does, and has done all of her life as a conservative Jewish person who's vegan, is her Shabbats are vegan, and she invites all kinds of random people to her Shabbat, and tries to vary the guest list. And she said several people have, at least become much more open to, if not vegan, over the 20 years or so that she's done that. So I think you can make it fun. I think you can make it a challenge. And I think what's really valuable about it is at the end of that week, you can point to the difference you've been trying to make. And it's so hard, right, to feel like, especially with the doom and gloom and the doom scrolling and all that, to feel like you're doing anything that matters. But you can say, I spent 3 hours for animals, and I, also didn't have a terrible time doing it.
I just spent a lot of time with my grandfather, who is 90 years old, and I just kept on thinking about, like, what is normal and when did it become normal? When did it become normal to eat so many animal products? How rare was it? And so what actually gives me a lot of hope is just thinking about how much has changed in my grandfather's diet in the last 90 years. If that amount of change can happen in 90 years, like, what can we do in the next 90 years? I'm really hopeful about that. And I wanted to echo, like, the importance of finding community. Again, each of us is uniquely positioned to create change within our communities, thinking about how we influence those communities. So I saw, Sanjay, you're thinking about AI. I cannot say enough good things about Hive, and some of the other networks that exist. Constantly, he talks about AI all the time. So there's a lot of good conversations to be had there. Mohit, as you're thinking about nutrition, oh my gosh, we should talk. I have a lot of ways that I deal with this. But yeah, I mean, some of our students are really thinking about masculinity and protein. And for some of our male students in particular, they're thinking about like, what are their arguments going to be? How can they influence others? How can they show off their athleticism on social media? There's a lot of people who are, being very critical about some of the claims around processed foods. Peanut butter is also processed food, right? So there's like lots of ways in which we can address these things. And Parker, as you're thinking about, some of our allies against industrial agriculture, what I've just learned is that there's a difference between partnering and collaborating versus condoning. And there's ways that we've been able to navigate that. And there's so much more that could be said, but having that strong community, having that strong network is really critical for anybody's advocacy efforts.
Great, thank you so much. So in the times remaining, I am compassionate towards everyone's desires to have their questions answered and unanswered, but I'm going to take a moment to ask a question of my own out of a little bit of selfishness, because I was excited to have you all here. And I think this is I'm framing it as a kind of a personal question, but it's a very salient question, which is, when we're talking about social norms and things you can do about, say, animal rights or animal justice or veganism becoming more kind of mainstream, something that Eva said earlier in the call about how animal rights movement are still kind of the black sheep or the, orphans of the left, as they're called. And so how do we change, how would you say, maybe in the last 5 minutes, how do we also change cultural norms around the movement adjacent to other social justice movements? I mean, this has been actually a lot of my time talking to people who are involved in other social justice movements. And we could spend a lot of time in the ways in which earlier animal rights movements have kind of made poor choices or insensitive, but that's not really the kind of things I want to dredge up. It's more so, what are the things you can do, you think, in your own community to kind of make the cause more palatable, more reasonable, more understandable to those who are also doing organizing, like Eva said, but maybe a different kind of organizing? Anyone can jump in on this first. Eva.
Sure. I mean, big question. I think that sensitivity is baseline, right? That we are not actively kind of hostile to other groups, to other movements. That's very much kind of minimal and absolutely not enough on its own. I'm really curious about kind of ways that we can collaborate in ways that are really holding our goals just kind of as strongly as other movements. So when we think about really partnering with, like, environmental groups on in the ways that they're interested in working, are there ways that we are also interested in working where we could have the same goals? I think that a lot of really when we notice that our work can overlap or even conflict with the work of other movements, kind of reaching out and working it out and talking, I think it can be useful. One kind of example of that is if we're doing a fur ban, like talking first about what the Native American exemption looks like, or something like this. And it's like, this is a big puzzle, and I'm not going to claim to have the answers really at all, but these are the things that are on my mind when I'm considering this. I think there's also something about humility, about like literally learning from, like, showing up to trainings put on by other groups and kind of being open about what we're learning for, that there's something about the respect of learning from other people and other groups that I think also breeds respect. There.
I would just say briefly, prejudice studies. So, I mean, it wasn't on the books when I was in graduate school. I think it's a great frame for how we can see the similarity between all of these attempts at equalizing how we move through the world with others.
Monica, would you like to add something here?
Well, is your question being answered, Jonathan? is my question back to you?
I know, I think somewhat. I think kind of what are the steps, I'm trying to find ways, as someone who is engaged, and we don't have much time, who engaged with a lot of progressive scholars and progressive activists, and it's still, right, it's just so hard to communicate, right? It's not that you're trying to convince them specifically about animal movement, but also the absolute enmeshing philosophically, historically, economically, politically of these things. And there's kind of a challenge here. And I tend to think that it's similar to the way that in which individuals walk around with racialized consciousnesses. We do walk around with these, it's not a good word, but like a humanized consciousness or anthropocentrized consciousness. And this pervades all of us. And so I'm trying to find ways to enter into that for the sake, I think it's not just for the sake of animals, it's for the sake of ourselves, to feel good, to feel in community, to feel like I also support these causes. We're actually in this unified struggle. And I'm trying to see if that's kind of the question I'm getting at. So thank you, Monica, for re-asking me the question. But I'm trying to think about ways that have worked in your own experiences or what you might suggest.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up this idea of racialized consciousness, right? Because if we were in, oh no, 1850, what would you do, right? If you're somebody who cares about racial equality, what would you do? What is actually, and how is what you're able to do impacted by everything else that was about to happen with, you know, this 1860 and 19, like so much has happened, right? So again, I would actually turn it first of all to yourself. Is it bothering you that some of these progressive academics that you might know, and I'm saying this to everybody, right? To what extent is it bothering you? To what extent are you triggered? How are you going to deal with that? Because I personally like have often gotten very offended. I felt that, you know, that like, how can you, because I come from the environmental space or from the teaching space. And to me, there was always just such great overlap. So when I was able to start answering that question for myself, then it became, how am I going to exemplify something that others want to be? And how am I going to share that? And sometimes it comes back down to like very personal relationships. Again, like where am I able to have the greatest influence is in my personal relationships. That means I'm taking people out to dinner. That means I'm being very thoughtful and bringing them vegan chocolate chip cookies, which might upset the Whole Foods plant-based folks, but I have to say my vegan chocolate chip cookies have made a lot of vegans, you know? So it's really just about like, I can't give you like a set, like do X, Y, Z, because it's really going to depend upon the relationships and the language that you're able to mirror based on like what you know about those the specific audiences.
Okay, thank you. I really do appreciate that. And I think it is kind of interesting to know. Maybe this comes back to the beginning of like what we're doing. Is it for ourselves, which isn't terrible to do for ourselves? Is it for others? Is it for community? And these are all part of one package. Maybe as Eva said, right? If we actually stop thinking of ourselves as this just individual acting kind of like monadically, independently, then we won't have to ask these questions as often. So I think we're here at the kind of our scheduled end, and this could go on forever, but that's fine because it just makes me excited for future roundtables and discussions and events where we can work these out in community together in service of, you know, what I like to think of is a unified horizon. And that's the most important. The horizon point is the same. So as long as we keep that in mind, having all of these wonderful discussions about how to get there. So I just want to take the last moment to thank you all so much for being here. Courtney, Monica, Eva, thank you for taking the time from your busy schedules. And I really encourage all of you to look up Mercy for Animals, New Roots Institute, Pax Fauna, and Pro Animal Future. Keep your eye on the ballot initiatives coming up in Colorado and in California. So keep them on your radar in the weeks to come. And Monica, Courtney, Eva, would you like to say something before we sign off? Monica?
Just, I recognize a lot of the names in the chat, like Hope, thank you. I mean, Parker, some of our fellows are here on this call right now. People are really working, like this is community, this is connection. Like we do need to be networking. Please do not hesitate to reach out. We're all actually pretty findable on LinkedIn. So, or, you know, on our website. So it's important that we connect. It's important that we be talking.
Great. Go ahead. Eva.
Wonderful to chat with you. Thank you so much. The questions were fantastic, and ditto that we are all very findable, and would love to stay in touch with anybody.
Courtney, I'll give you a chance to.
Yeah, no, I just really appreciate the opportunity to think and talk about these things, and the movement will go on, and it will go on after we're gone. And so being a part of it now in this moment in time is a real honor. And I appreciate you holding space for the conversation, and there'll be people who are in this call that will go on to lead. And that gives me a lot of hope and a lot of sense of peace about everything that I try to accomplish, with others. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Taina, for assisting us on this call. And I want to encourage you all also to just pay attention to what's happening with vegan studies at Arihanta Institute and our larger programming. Lots of fun stuff, interesting stuff, important stuff coming out in 2024 and through 2025 and beyond. So with that, we will see you soon. Thank you all for being here.